I'm Lucy Bernholtz. I'm the director of the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University and the host of this series of conversations. I am calling in here from the occupied territory of the Muwekma Ohlone, San Francisco, California, and also that is the territory where Stanford University is based. And we're delighted that there are more than 300 people scheduled to join us for this conversation from all over the globe. And I invite you to use the chat function of Zoom to introduce yourself, tell us where you're calling in, and if there's a particular interest you have in digital infrastructure, you can begin to know the people that are in the room with you by sharing that information in the chat. I want to take just a minute to position ourselves in this conversation, and then I will introduce our speakers and they will take the conversation off. The Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford is designed to understand, inform, and improve the functioning of an independent civil society within democracies. There are two areas of specific interest for the lab right now and in the near future. The first of those has to do with these questions of infrastructure. We're looking for and reliant upon digital infrastructures, and for civil society to thrive and for democracies to therefore thrive, those infrastructures must be designed in ways that will enable independent collective action. The second major area of interest for the lab are the implications of our current and potential future digital political economies on our ability to assemble and associate. And we have numerous opportunities and initiatives that we'd invite you to join if you're interested in those issues. So with that, let me say that we're very excited to be kicking off this conversation. And it's one that we have scheduled in 3 consecutive sections, if you will. We'll be starting today. We will continue on October 27th and then again on November 10th. And my great hope is that this conversation will continue beyond even those 3 scheduled discussions, because what we have planned here, the narrative arc, goes from explaining this idea of digital infrastructure to looking at some very specific examples of it, to thinking about what it means now that the internet is in everything, and how should we be thinking about infrastructure. And we will be doing so through a number of different perspectives, all of them central, all of them important, and all of them a challenge to the internet as we've come to know it as a mass commodity and means of both communication and powering our society over the last 10 years. So the way this conversation today is scheduled to flow is we will start with a description of a certain logic of digital public infrastructure, and then invite in 4 or 5 other perspectives on that logic and some additional logics, ways to get our minds thinking about what digital infrastructure could actually be and what would it mean if it were built and designed and made accessible in the public interest. There'll be at least half an hour for interaction with the panelists, and we ask you to use the chat function primarily to introduce yourselves to each other and to share resources, but to use the Q&A function to direct questions that I will then bring before the folks we have on screen. So chat for the group among you, and Q&A for trying to get questions to our panelists. We will be recording just the first hour of the conversation, the focused panel part, and a written synthesis of this conversation will be made available within just a few days and in advance of our next conversation, which is scheduled for Tuesday, the 27th. Following the series of 3, we will provide a full written synthesis of the 3 conversations, and I invite you to join us for as many of them as you can, particularly the session on November 10th, which is designed to enable all of you to work together to take these ideas to action. So with that, let me quickly introduce our panelists and also let you know that the hashtag that we're asking people to use for this conversation, should you be so inclined, is hashtag DP infrastructure. We're going to start with Ethan Zuckerman, who is a incoming associate professor at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, who's going to get us started on the logic that he uses and the framework that he's put forth for digital public infrastructure. Then he will be joined in conversation by Janice Gates, who is with the Equitable Internet Initiative in the city of Detroit, as part of the Detroit Community Technology Project. Maricha Shaki, who is the International Policy Director at Stanford Cyber Policy Center, Katie Knight, who is the Executive Director of the Siegel Family Endowment, and we hope Sibella Malambi, who is the founder of Bantocracy and also a fellow at Harvard's Carr Center and the Berkman Klein Center. So we'll get the conversation started with those perspectives, and then we will invite you to join us. With no further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Ethan Zuckerman. Ethan?
Thank you so much. I'm going to try to get to the point where I can share my slides with you, and then we'll sort of go from there. While I'm starting up, let me thank you for acknowledging the real owners of the land that Stanford sits on, and I'm going to similarly acknowledge that I am coming to you from occupied Mohican land, which we often know as Western Massachusetts. I want to talk a little bit about what I've been calling Facebook logic. Facebook logic is, I think, the underlying way that we think about a lot of different types of social media. But I want to talk about why I think it's so important to interrogate it right now. And the reason that I think it's so important right at the moment is that we're at a particularly hard time. 2020 is not a year that anyone's feeling particularly good about, between the coronavirus, the possible collapse of democracy in the United States, the ongoing reminders of structural racism and violence that are threats to communities of color in the US. There's near universal agreement that things are in fact not going very well. For those of us who study the internet, there's also a sense that the internet, if anything, is sort of aggravating these tendencies, that as much as we might have hoped that the internet might be a space that was beyond race, somehow beyond class, in fact, what we're actually seeing is that the internet appears to be intensely polarizing, that it seems to be pushing people towards political extremes, that perhaps using Facebook, Twitter, YouTube is making us angrier, making us more polarized, making us less capable of actually working together. Now, as a scholar in this space, I've got a couple of things to say about this. The first is that, to be honest, the jury's out. There's actually been lots of studies done that suggest that social effects on people's happiness, effects on our democratic behavior from the internet are pretty modest across the board, that there are extremes, both positive and negative, but it's way too early to make any sort of sweeping judgments to say Facebook is evil, it's doing terrible things to us. But at the same time, I also want to say there's no reason we shouldn't be pursuing this. And it wouldn't be a surprise if Facebook and Twitter and YouTube are harming us, because actually they haven't been designed in such a way to help us as citizens, to help us be better participants in a democracy, to help us be better neighbors, better supporters to one another. Now, most of the conversation about what's wrong with social media sort of rolls up to this idea that maybe Facebook should behave a little bit more differently. And either Facebook should make these changes, they should be much more careful about sharing mis or disinformation, or maybe the government should step in and make these changes on Facebook's behalf. And what I want to suggest is neither of those feels very satisfactory to me. Neither Facebook nor the US Congress are particularly highly trusted institutions in the United States right now. In fact, they both come up as some of the least trusted entities in our society. And I'm not sure that either of them is actually very well positioned to try to figure out how you fix social media, making it less toxic and also making it better. What I want to suggest is that we actually need to think much, much bigger. We have to think about the logic that animates a network like Facebook and start imagining the possibility of other logics that we could use to build other digital and social infrastructures. And here I want to tip my hat to Katie Knight, who's done this great job sort of drawing a distinction between three types of infrastructures. We have the physical infrastructures that we're all used to thinking about, of roads and bridges and even things like fiber optic cables. We also have digital infrastructures, the tools that we use to stay in touch with one another, the email system, search engines like Google, social media spaces, and we have social infrastructures. We have things that allow us to connect with one another as members of a society. They might be libraries, they might be public parks, as Eli Pariser is fond of making analogies to. And when we talk about social media spaces, we're looking at something that is an intersection between social infrastructure and digital infrastructure that rides on top of physical infrastructure. And what I want to suggest is that there is a logic behind how these spaces use these infrastructures, and we can actually learn something from the past in deciding what logic we want to use. So I want to take us back. I want to take us back almost 100 years, maybe even a little bit more than 100 years, to the rise of radio. So radio shows up as we know it right now in 1912. 1912 is the first moment where we can hear voice or music modulated over broadcast radio. And what's sort of remarkable is within 10 years, by 1922, not only is radio pervasive all over the world, but there's 3 different logics behind how it ends up getting used. In the United States, radio is completely commercial. People start setting up commercial radio stations, and they set them up everywhere. Department stores are frequently radio stations. They'll play records and encourage you to go buy the record player. Hotels become radio stations. They'll encourage you to come dance in the ballroom while they set up a microphone and they play the orchestra so that you can dance at home. And within 10 years, you get models like WOR where they're selling airtime to advertisers and they're using that to subsidize news and entertainment programming. But the key thing about radio in the US is that everybody's involved, everybody's welcome. There are nonprofits, there are churches, there are universities, but fairly quickly the corporations come in, and with a business model that works, they take it over and they have nationwide networks. And we see that as early as 10 years in. The USSR is a little later to radio. They're going through the Russian Revolution, but by 1918, the Soviet Union is firmly in place, and they look at radio and they say, this is great. We've got all of these uneducated peasants, they can't read, and so they don't know why communism is such a wonderful, wonderful thing for them. We're gonna tell them over and over and over again. But they have a problem. No one can afford a radio. They're peasants. So what the Soviet Union does is puts loudspeakers in every town square, in every factory, and they attach them to the radio, and you get a broadcast. It's one voice. It comes from the central party. It's there to tell you why communism is wonderful for you. You can tell these Russian radios because they only have one knob. It's volume. You can turn it off or on or make it louder or softer, but there's only one channel because that's all you need. Now, Britain ends up taking a third logic on this. They also have only one station. It's the BBC, but it's this fascinating cooperation between all of these different radio pioneers. And rather than becoming the voice of the state, as it becomes in the Soviet Union, it's an independent broadcaster. It has an independent newsroom. It has a public service mandate. It's trying to give people information that they need to be citizens of Great Britain. And it actually does a lovely job of establishing its independence from the government very early on in its life cycle. So my point here is not a comprehensive history of radio. That would take a little longer, but this idea that in the first 10 years of this technology in different places, we get completely different logics. What is it good for? How is it supported? How does it make money? In the Soviet Union, it's simply an apparatus of the state. In the UK, it's a tax on radio receivers. In the US, it's paying for advertising. And it has totally different uses and purposes. It's explicitly pro-civic in the UK. It's much more sort of an entertainment and multi-use medium within the United States. My worry is that of all the different models that we might use to support digital infrastructures, digital social infrastructures in the United States, we've settled on one particular model. And it's this model of surveillance capitalism. We get everything for free, it's supported by ads, but to make those ads work better, the system watches everything we do. And many thinkers out there have observed that there's some really unpleasant effects associated with this sort of system. These systems want to keep us watching, so they amplify content that is angry or very high in emotion. They are watching us constantly, which means they can feel really sort of unheimlich. They'll target content to us that feels deeply uncomfortable. They might be being used to manipulate us or even to try to change the way that we vote or the way that we perceive things, although believe me, there's good arguments about whether that's actually true or not. But I want to identify what I think of as Facebook logic. So here are some of the characteristics of it. There's one Facebook, right? It doesn't matter if you're in Myanmar or if you're in Germany, you're using Facebook, and it's the same platform. And it reminds you all the time that you are part of a community of almost 3 billion users. No matter what you're using Facebook for, whether you're an organizer, whether you're a marketer, whether you're a 10-year-old kid, it's the same platform. And it has the same functionality, the same basic structure associated with it. Users have basically no role in deciding how this platform works. The best we can do is we can identify offensive content, and then something happens that we have no control over. And there's opaque algorithms. We can't review what they are. We trade our theories about how they work that pumps up some content, suppresses other content, and we really have no idea what the rules of the road are as far as what is allowable or not allowable speech until we steer outside of the line. As I mentioned, it's ad-supported, it's free, but we're paying for it with surveillance. It's very, very hard for anyone else to build tools. Facebook actually challenges anyone who tries to interoperate. And ultimately, it's governed by the logic of venture capital. It has to grow like crazy. And now that it's a publicly traded company, it still has to grow like crazy. So what I want to suggest is this. I want to suggest that social media spaces that work the way that Facebook does aren't providing us with spaces that we need to be good citizens. And frankly, they're not even trying. They're not really looking at this and saying, what would be helpful to introduce me to people who I might not agree with and give us a healthy conversation? They're not taking on the role of trying to curate healthy discussions as folks involved with things like the Civic Signals Initiative are trying to figure out what would be a healthy, productive conversation. That hasn't made it into that conversation yet. But I want to suggest that this is our fault as well. And we're compounding market failure, the failure of Facebook as a market entity to do something that's good for us as citizens. We're compounding this failure with our own failure of imagination. And our own failure of imagination is our failure to imagine and design and build something that works better. And so what I want to challenge people to do is get beyond, I think, a couple of questions that aren't very helpful. Should you quit Facebook? Knock yourself out. It's not going to change Facebook. Is Facebook bad for democracy? Is social media harming democracy? Quite possibly. And we should be researching, we should be paying attention to it. But we really want to ask this question: what do we want these digital social infrastructures, what do we want social media to do for democracy? So I want to propose a rival logic. I'm going to call this a civic logic. And this is a way of thinking about building some radically different online spaces. The first thing to know is that this is not a Facebook killer. This is a way of surrounding Facebook and Twitter and YouTube with thousands of new social networks. These networks are not for everybody. They're for actual communities. They might be good for groups of 20, maybe up to 20,000 users. They could have very different functionalities. They could have very different technical affordances. Maybe some of them are only open to people in a specific geography. Maybe some of them are very heavily moderated. They have different norms that go along with them as well. The communities behind these networks are the ones who set the rules. These are self-governed networks. Now, this sounds crazy, but this actually happens pretty often. A network like Reddit has a good amount of self-government with someone going in and sort of moderating it. And here, we're actually designing these communities for governance from the ground up. They are designed to be interoperable. Their goal is not to lock you into using them. It's actually to have you using the existing networks you're already using and then trying these new networks and seeing, do you like the way that they work? Do you like the way that they feel? They can be supported a whole bunch of different ways. They might be supported by subscription. Some of them are going to be subsidized, maybe by the town you live in, as a chance to have your town meeting partially online. And they could be owned by any number of things, not only companies, but also cooperatives, existing civic groups, so on and so forth. Now, obviously, this is huge. I'm skating just over the top of it. One of the questions you should be asking is how the heck do you pay for it? And I think one of the ways you might pay for this is following some advice that Paul Romer has put on the table. He's a Nobel-winning economist. He has suggested that surveillance advertising has all sorts of negative downsides for us. And it suggested that we actually start putting a punitive tax on it to try to get people to move away from the model. What I want to do is take Professor Romer's tax and use it to create these new infrastructures. So if we take the world of surveillance advertising and we put even sort of a 1% tax on top of it, you would end up generating a funding pool that's almost $700 million a year. That is way bigger than all the other sort of players in the space who are trying to create alternative infrastructures and resources. Now, it's going to take a while before we get there. It might take significant time and real support from people in the space until we end up getting to the point where we could reasonably tax this and do something with this. I think it's critical that we start building in the meantime. So this is a question I'm often asked about all of this. I want to suggest that I might not be quite as nuts as you think. We're already seeing platforms that operate on very different logics. This is one of my favorite, Majal. It's a platform designed for gay and lesbian youth in the Gulf. It is wholly anonymous. It is very carefully moderated because the whole point is to create safe spaces for queer kids in countries where you can be arrested for being queer. This is gel.com. This is a US startup that works really hard to try to get people on different sides of issues talking about the pluses and minuses of them. It's almost a Wikipedia type logic to sort of get arguments on both sides of an equation. I've had lots of great arguments about what happens with arguments that have more than two sides to it, but it's a wonderful step in the right direction. We even see people who, frankly, have had a lot to do with the internet that we have right now, trying to think about different logics for social media. This is Wiki Tribune. This is started by Jimmy Wales, the co-founder of Wikipedia. It's an attempt at a much more civil and much more thoughtful and participatory social network. And ultimately, we have an infrastructure under all of this by Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web itself, designed to help enable a new set of decentralized social networks and other apps. We even have governments looking at this, like the Dutch government, where people who run the public broadcasters and who run major cultural institutions are getting together to say, can we turn away from surveillance logic, Facebook logic, and start building new digital public spaces that we have more control over? Tons more to say about this. We're sharing a lot of information about this at a new site we're launching, publicinfrastructure.org. We've just launched a podcast today. You're the first to hear about it. You can subscribe through Public Infrastructure. It's called Reimagining the Internet, and it's a set of conversations with people who are designing and building these new networks. I am so excited to shut up right now and hear from the other brilliant folks who are on this panel. I hope this sparks some ideas. Lucy, thank you so much for creating this space. And I'm really looking forward to the rest of the conversation. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ethan. Thank you very much. So, and thank you for introducing, such a clear way of distinguishing the various elements of what you're proposing with this framework of a logic. What I'm going to ask each of the panelists to do is to get us started by sharing your thoughts on the logic that animates your work. What is at the center of the work you're doing, be that building new networks or designing different social media approaches as Ethan described. We're talking about infrastructure here. Ethan focused on social media in particular, but we don't need to stay there. We can go where your work takes us. So I'll ask Janice to get us started about the logic of the work that's happening in the Equitable Internet Initiative in Detroit that you lead, Janice.
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. So first I'll give like a brief description of what the Equitable Internet Initiative is. And it's essentially where we teach and train Detroit residents to build neighborhood governed internet infrastructure and connect their communities using a gigabit connection. And we look at EII as being, as Ethan was talking about, as being literally the alternative to some of those other systems. And I would say we probably have 4 logics that really kind of root our work. I'd say the first one is principles. The Detroit Community Technology Project, which the Equitable Internet Initiative is a program of, grew out of the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition, and specifically the Equitable Internet Initiative, which I'm going to call EII, grew out of 2 of those principles that the Detroit Digital Justice Coalition created. And those essentially focus on access, participation, ownership, and healthy communities. And EII was specifically forged from the principles around participation and healthy communities. The EII also formed, when it was launched, formed our own set of principles, and those, focus also on community ownership, alternative energy, security, privacy, consent, storytelling, education. Another logic that I think really grounds our work is racial equity. Our approach to the digital divide in Detroit is a decentralized approach. And Detroit, really sits at the intersection of, race, poverty, and the lack of internet access. The city is a majority Black city. 30% of the residents here remain unconnected. And the city is now ground zero for mass surveillance technology experiments. I think another logic is the decentralized approach. And this really just means that there's no hierarchical structure, no single person or group that's really designing the solutions and profiting from them, which seems to be the direction that I think many cities are moving in now as they, work to bridge the digital divide that has become, I think, more urgent in the midst of COVID-19. But EII, we don't design for, we build, with the community. And I think a final logic that I'll say is that anyone, can be a technologist. The residents that we train, we refer to them as digital stewards, and they are people of color, they're senior citizens, teenagers, artists, organizers, media makers, and neighborhood leaders. So those are really, I would say, the 4 that logics that really ground our work.
Thank you. It's impressive to me the grounding in racial justice, and the similarity in some of the components of the logic to what Ethan outlined as a civic logic, but with a very clear, broader than social media reach, both physical parts of the physical infrastructure and the digital infrastructure, as well as that social component of the learning and the stewardship. And with that, why don't I ask Katie Knight to jump in, who with the Siegel Family Endowment, who that tripartite approach to thinking about infrastructure, physical, digital, and social has at least in part been credited to the work that Katie is doing with her colleagues at Siegel. Katie?
Yeah, thanks, Lucy. I think fundamentally, Ethan described this vision that we have of thinking about infrastructure beyond just the physical, and really calling out that there are physical, digital, and social infrastructures, and that those things overlap and need to be considered in a sort of multidimensional way. And so sort of taking it a level further and thinking about, I think, what both Ethan and Janice are talking about in terms of the aspirational goal of governance that can look different from the start. So we can design systems, we can design social media or communication platforms, we can design means of creating new physical infrastructure for internet access in such a way that is incorporating this decentralized governance, or this sort of governance that is inclusive and brings people with different perspectives to the table, and ideally with perspectives from all three corners of the triangle of infrastructure. I also think that governance, the way that we think about it, can maybe help us with an intermediate step, right? From before we can get to this aspirational goal that I think platforms like Facebook or other communications and social media platforms, we can look at those innovations and say, actually, we, the people that use them, are interested in taking on a more substantive role in governance here. We can think about regulation from the perspective of not just how do we regulate these companies so they stop doing harm, but how can we actually be involved in the decision making about what is happening on these platforms? How can we make them more useful spaces for the public interest rather than just spaces for surveillance technology to thrive? And so for us, in looking at infrastructure and really trying to promote this notion that social infrastructure matters as much as physical infrastructure, that intersection of social and digital matter as much as a bridge or a water pipe, we really are also trying to elevate its importance to a place where we citizens can have a bigger role in the governance of it and make it more effective for us rather than for the people who stand to profit from it.
Which really speaks, it seems to me, in a U.S. and a perhaps Western European context, to this critical component both of this person's role in the governance of these technologies, and as Detroit's been able to demonstrate, actually in the identification of the opportunity, the skills to implement, and the skills to design. So it's front end, back end, and it's really coming from communities in a very powerful way. That's quite a significant different possibility from a corporate owned and led series of governance making bodies that are then only interacting with government officials. We have two other people I want to hear from. One of them, Maricha Shaki, you fit right into that role of government regulator, former government regulator, thinking about the interactions with the companies that provide these products and that have become so fundamental. How do you see these alternative logics where the actual infrastructure of social media and beyond would be community designed and governed from the get-go?
Well, thank you so much. And I really appreciate Ethan's introduction and being a part of this discussion. So I'm often reminded as a European that now works in Silicon Valley of the need to sometimes emphasize that regulation or governance is not only there to restrict. I think around social media and any kind of regulatory intervention, there has really been this tone that a regulatory action is against the tech companies, right? And I think perhaps the European tradition is slightly more reliant on the notion that regulation enables and also clearly safeguards the freedoms and rights of people. Perhaps that's best illustrated in this context by the right to privacy, which people may perceive as being one of those regulations designed to be against the tech companies, but in fact, they're also meant to protect citizens from overreach by their own governments. And it's not without reason, because actually many Europeans have suffered greatly from the abuse of power by governments long before tech companies existed or social media companies existed. And so having also been in a position of making policy and thinking about what our role is, I think you always have to keep in mind, what you're designing or governing or regulating for, and that you can never depend on the stated good intentions of one actor or another. So there has to be some kind of equal treatment across the field as well. And so I jotted down as I was listening and thinking about these logics that inform our own worlds, about what informed me when I was thinking about what legal provisions needed to be in place. But I still think about now when we think about the tech sector, social media companies, and how to make sure that the public interest and public values are not commercialized to an extent that it really erodes the very foundations of our open society. So I think what's always motivated me is to govern for creating maximum space and freedom for people to make their own choices. So not to be dependent on one entity or another, or to have a lack of choice from, being poor or being repressed or something like that. And so I think aspects to really think about, and I heard reflected in different ways by previous speakers as well, is representation. So how do you make sure that those who make the decisions actually reflect their constituencies, whether it be 3 people or 3 million people? With what legitimacy do they govern? And I think that is extremely important when we think about social media companies. The outsized power is one challenge, but with what legitimacy, are a handful of companies building entire ecosystems of information and governing the flows of data going over them? Then fairness, which I think is a principle that often requires very different actions to achieve fairness, which could be a level playing field, meaning equal opportunities for companies to operate on, but also a notion of justice, for example, right? Creating fairness when there is non-respect for rules or benchmarks or ethics or principles. And so I think that those guiding anchors can also help us think about why specifically and explicitly governing for the public interest vis-a-vis social media companies, a regulatory intervention is not a restriction, but actually an enabling component if it's done well. So I'll leave it there, and I'm happy to engage further in the discussion with everybody.
Thanks, Maricha. And I think it's actually quite helpful to articulate the logic of governance and regulation. There's some conversation going on in the chat that I want to use to partly introduce our next commenter, Sabelo Malambi, because the question is about imagination and imaginaries. And what we've heard so far is striking to me in its consistency of kind of operational changes that might be possible, whether the centering goal is greater citizen control or racial equity, or a logic of governing a corporate behavior. But Sabelo, your work actually centers a different set of core, or maybe a different set of core values, or centers those values in a different way than I think the white Western relationship that many people here are so familiar with would understand. Could you tell us a little bit about the work that you're doing to center the Ubuntu traditions and logic, and how that helps open up different ways of thinking about digital infrastructure and who fits into it where? I think you're muted. I can't hear you. Can others hear him?
Sabelo, we can't hear you, my friend. Maybe pull the headphones and see if you can go directly into the mic.
Still no sound. Okay, Sabelo, I'm not quite sure how to help with the audio. So we'll go. We'll make space for you to join us when your volume works. But let's actually. I want to ask those who've already spoken another question, which is that. And while I very much appreciate the attention to social media, and I know that's where Ethan's work is focusing, I know that the Janice and Katie and Maricha's and Sabella's work reaches far beyond that. So let me ask you, I was struck in your slide deck, Ethan, you had a picture of a surveillance camera in a supermarket. It's also true that the infrastructure we're talking about now collects data in so many different ways that while social media and information and communications is an important part of this, it's by no means the be all and end all of our considerations when we're thinking about digital infrastructure. I'm curious either for any of you, Katie, Janice, Maricha, if as you recognize the role the internet plays beyond just a communication mechanism, if that's changed the way you have to think about engaging communities in the ways that you're describing, or laying the governance playing field the way you describe, Maricha.
Maybe I'll say something first, and then
Sure.
Maricha will chip in on roles of the government, and Katie may talk about the sort of broader definitions of infrastructure that she's been using. I'm really interested in this question of what it means to build tools that have an explicit civic logic behind them. For the last 9 years, I ran a center called the Center for Civic Media over at MIT. I'm really interested in this idea of building tools with an explicit civic goal behind them. You could imagine that being a search engine. You know, for me, it would be a search engine that was auditable and reviewable, where you could be far more secure that you don't have a government or political party putting their thumb on the scale. I can imagine tools for generating revenue that are much more civic in focus. And they would do things like protect us from surveillance rather than sort of forcing you into it, even if you're using something like Google AdSense on your page. The reason that I'm going after social media first is in many ways, it's a very young system. We still have new platforms coming up. There's thousands of new social media systems out there, including some very interesting decentralized ones that people are developing. It doesn't feel quite as fixed as some of these other problems are. The other piece behind it is that social media is coming under an incredible amount of scrutiny right now because it does seem to be so powerful for spreading disinformation and for creating political dissensus. So it felt for me like a good place to put the lever. Finally, there's a personal piece of this. I helped invent the field of user-generated content back in the late 1990s with tripod.com. So I feel a very personal responsibility for this space and sort of a desire to get into it. Part of what I'm so excited about with you putting together this series, Lucy, and the work that you're doing, Katie, and sort of looking at funding in this space is that I think there's enormous space for cooperation and solidarity from the layer of the physical network, like Janice is working on in Detroit, all the way up to the sort of applications. This is just the place where I'm planning on digging in first, but part of my goal is not only to build social media that works in a civic logic, but to be a great ally to everybody else who's working on things like civic logic down to the level of network infrastructure.
Great, thank you for that, Ethan. And I think we've got Sabelo, and I think that's a nice transition then to think about this other way, Sabelo's work and his focus on infrastructure. Do we have a connection to you?
Yes,
Wonderful.
Thank you, Lucy, and thank you, Ethan, for the great introduction, and thank you to all the panelists and everyone who's joined this conversation. I wanted to sort of begin by giving the framework that a lot of us now in the global South, especially in Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, this framework that we're now using, which is sort of rests on the idea of decolonizing the internet, decolonizing technology. And just to give just a brief introduction, the central idea is, value systems. What have we been told about the internet? These are the myths that we've been given about the technology, the internet, and just, much of the major dominant systems of control that have been passed on to everyone else, in the global south. We've been given many promises about how the internet would increase, for example, freedoms, democracy, that is the place for the mind to be free. We were told that the internet would allow for self-governance. We would all just somehow naturally come to a set of agreements that we would experience, the freedom of the internet. And by experiencing that, we would then demand it offline. We were told that if internet usage, for example, uses in Africa, then the continent would experience a massive economic growth and empowerment. But none of this is materialized, right? And if we look at history, we can realize that, this is a pattern that is, been happening historically. And these are usually tied around, ideas of autonomy, individualism, all at the expense of the community, all at the expense of solidarity rights. And we seldom emphasize the individual's obligation to the community's well-being. So these are the central issues that we find, whether it's in, capitalism, colonialism, and now even the internet infrastructure itself. And I would like to suggest that as we're looking at, digital public infrastructure, it's also beneficial to think about it, or to realize that the internet itself is a colonized space. So we're entering a space that is already colonized. And so reclaiming the digital infrastructure for public interest then truly is an act of decolonization. Now, how is the internet actually colonized? Well, there are many similarities, of course, with historical colonialism. Some of them being that, in the historical sense, Western nations were annexing, already occupied lands. They were centralizing land, they were centralizing power and resources. And to do so effectively, this included surveillance, means of indoctrination, influencing attitudes, decisions, behaviors, in order to, assert, European dominance or even white supremacy. And, this also included restricting and controlling movement and creating a new type of economy. And even within this new type of economy, artificially inflating the wages in order to, maximize the processes of extractions, of extracting value and extracting resources from the people and from the land. Now, the difference here is that, because people already lived in those occupied lands, it was necessary to use force and to use violence in order to take those resources and to take those, to take the land. But, with today's surveillance capitalism, like what Ethan was talking about, we don't require that direct force anymore, because the internet and its infrastructure is already centralized. The digital algorithms, AI algorithms, are being used to affect how we interact with each other, how we consume information, how we think of ourselves. And, a new economy has also been created, just like in the old colonialism, a new economy has been created, which literally, is based on the commodification of humans, and also commodification of how we interact online and how we experience our relationships. And this is really an internet that is designed for the extraction and centralization of value amongst a few corporations, few countries, and few continents. So digital infrastructure then, at least from a non-Western perspective or different value systems, or even just speaking from, someone who is from the global South, is that we need to sort of start thinking about a decolonized space. And realizing the relationships that already exist in this space that is already there, that it is a very colonized space. If we think about the simple example of Facebook and Google and so forth being used in sub-Saharan Africa and other global South places, most of how the world actually even accesses the internet or deals with it is through, these two platforms. And that's already, a very centralized, controlled, heavily surveilled, heavily monitored space. And so then to create this infrastructure, to think about it, we sort of have to now peel back the layers and started thinking about how to actually decolonize, this space, AI, technology, the infrastructure, and pushing it out there. And I'm so happy that my panelists were giving different ideas on how we can do so, how we can democratize power, how we can create infrastructure that's probably owned by the public. We talked a little bit about Tim Berners-Lee's solution. So there are many solutions that are being proposed that are out there. But I think the Ubuntu framework, which is sort of like my key focus, is that whatever we end up deciding and doing, it must be sort of premised on human dignity and human worth. And so centering humans in the entire process and making sure that technology, firstly and foremost, is meant to serve human populations, and that different communities can sort of shape their own outcomes. They're able to experience, to create alternative systems that better capture their values and better capture, how, where they want to go as different societies. And lastly, I would say, one way to do so is to really think more about, taxing big tech companies. I'm not aware if the major foreign companies pay any taxes, for example, in the African continent. Several countries like Kenya and Nigeria have tried to create legislation to begin doing that effort, but we haven't seen much public effort in having these companies sort of pay the fair share for operating in these in those markets. And so, of course, those funds could be used for other purposes, including building alternative digital public infrastructure. But whatever decisions and whatever route we take, I think ultimately we have to always sort of center human dignity and human worth in every step of the way.
Thank you, Sabelo. And I want to ask you a question, or I'm still going to start drawing in some questions from the chat and the Q&A, and encourage people to continue the conversation that's going on there, which is really quite exciting. But there was a specific observation from a couple of people among us who said, we've talked a lot about the internet itself, and it's not the only part of digital infrastructure. There's SMS and all kinds of other things. And I guess a question to each of you as we think about this, is there a smartest place or a most leveraged place for us to focus our attention, or especially given the number of examples that people are sharing in the chat, which we will capture and share out in the notes, where are you most excited about successful efforts to decolonize or take community control of some piece of infrastructure? And how do we build bigger upon that? And I'll start with you, Sabelo, if there's one in particular you wanted to mention, but then anyone else who wants to chime in, please do.
Thank you so much, Lucy. The area that me and my colleagues from Black in AI, for example, Decolonized AI, Masakane, these are communities that are focusing on the intersection of artificial intelligence and the different inequalities that it could worsen. And so I think what I'm excited about really is sort of looking ahead into the future and seeing where can we start to sort of dismantle and decolonize, in particular, artificial intelligence technology for the potential it has to fundamentally transform, human lives, human interactions, and for the danger that it can have in sort of worsening inequalities. One quick example I can give is I was in a panel where we were talking about using artificial intelligence to sort of improve how humans operate. So maybe you're a mechanic using AI to sort of make superhumans, superhumans who can, maybe retain information quicker, improving human memory, human physical strength and abilities. But then, the question again lies at, who will have access to this technology, right? What are the power distributions that are there? Will we in some way, create like a reverse eugenics where we have like, a super human race, that we're trying to create, and then the people again who don't have the the access and the ability to even access these tools. So one, how do we artificial intelligence in how it shapes our lives and the goals that we have for society, and also how do we then change the the social processes that even allow for AI to be possible. The funding, who gets the funding, who gets the skill set to even build these tools, who gets the promotions, the trainings, who has the ability to bring, these ideas into reality. Again, if it's always centralized amongst a few people, a few countries, continents, corporations, and, we'll be having the same conversations years and years down the road until we finally begin to really distribute power.
Thank you, Sabelo. I have someone in particular I'd like to hear. I'm wondering if any of the panelists in particular want to jump in and build off of what Sabelo said about where to start, if you will. Maricha?
Yeah, I wanted to build on what Sabelo said, and I think it's very powerful, and also come back to one of the things that Ethan mentioned about civic spaces, right? And so in an ideal world, and I think what Sabelo said was very clear that we don't live in an ideal world, but principally, I think democracy best caters for optimal space for civic values, civic participation, and civic purposes. And so what is even more striking to me as we think about how we landed where we are today is that the internet and presumably a lot of the technological revolution came with this promise of creating a better world, but also a sort of detached world, right? Detached from the offline world or the real world or whatever. And I think that was illusional or delusional from the beginning. But increasingly we can no longer see technology as a sector or as an area, but really as a layer that is almost a blanket, woven into every aspect of our lives. And so becomes even more remarkable that the hands-off approach, particularly by democracies, I should say, to governance has been so pervasive. And now that we've seen that the sort of well-intended outcomes have not materialized, I would say perhaps a way to start is to not make this be about technology, but to make this be about democracy, about civics, about, fairness, non-discrimination, all the values that we can deliberate, because we will probably not all agree, or at least, if we want to be representative, we have to think about different voices. But I find it increasingly hard to understand why democratic governments, civic actors have let go of their agency and their ability to make sure that the digital world with all its aspects actually would be better and would be part of the set of values that we fought so hard for, that are continue to be fought for in the offline world. So I am increasingly starting what I think needs to happen with democracy and not with technology. And I'll end there.
Thank you, Maricha. And that actually also draws in several of the questions in the Q&A as well as in the chat. And I'll direct this to Katie and or Janice about the work that you've done, or that Janice is doing and that Katie is writing about and thinking about in terms of starting with the social, starting with the human, starting with what the communities want and articulate and strive for. How do we create more of that or lift it up? There's lots of mentions in the chat and some in the Q&A about the existing institutions like libraries that might be a bigger part of that. But I think it's also very much about, to both Ethan, Maricha, and Sabella's point about humans seeing themselves as having agency in all of this. You've been very successful in Detroit in a small scale. Is that where you're starting, Janice? Am I saying that right, or am I missing something important?
I'm sorry, repeat the last part. Is that where we're starting?
That you start with the human ability to know what they want. The communities know what they want. They know what they need, and you're finding ways to help them see that influence over digital infrastructure, not starting with the tech, but starting with the people.
Yeah, exactly. Like I mentioned earlier, EII it's a very decentralized approach in connecting the community. And, one of the things that we, believe and always try to focus on in our work is that those who are the most affected are the closest to what should be part of designing the solutions for the problems that exist in their communities. And those that, are the most affected in Detroit are, people of color, Black people, people who are unemployed, people who live in poverty, people who are living in, vulnerable communities that are prone to, flooding or power outages. We believe those people should be the first people at the table. That's why we believe that we should build with them. So when EII was launched in 2016, and then before we even built out the pilot in 2017, our team of digital stewards, the first thing that they did was survey their neighborhoods to actually see what is really needed here, what already exists here. How can we bring equitable internet into these neighborhoods in a way that's healing and restorative rather than extractive? So they started, including the community kind of at the ground level in the very beginning of the conversations. Even the 3 community anchor organizations that we worked with, they were a part of the visioning process for the entire project. And even today, we're still including the community, still trying to, make it clear that this is, neighborhood governed internet. So they participate in, participatory design sessions, community meetings. Each network has a neighborhood advisory board, and then our stewards. One of the ways in which they work to kind of demystify technology in their community is to do digital literacy trainings, which kind of right now are focused on, some basic computer skills, social media, setting up emails, but we've also moved into trainings around digital security, privacy, and consent.
Thank you. And Katie, as you've thought about this too, the connection here, actually everyone on the group has spoken to this intersection between social and digital as both a new way of thinking about infrastructure, but also so many of the examples, if you have a chance to scan through the chat, so much of what people are sharing are these community-led I shouldn't call them community-led successful efforts. And I guess the question I want to ask is, when we think about imagination now, we've been so habituated to think of scale as a good thing. But if you listen to what you've all been saying, there's an alternative of fragmented local control here that's being called for. Where do we go from here? Is this just going to be an antagonistic relationship? Is scale holding us back, not just because of the power of large forces, but also as a mental model for where we need to go? How do we get from so many experiments and efforts that actually manifest the many principles you've described to a place where that's available and maybe the norm for more people? Where are the points of connection there?
Yeah, I think a few things. So coming back to what Maricha was saying about the context for what we're thinking about, not just starting from technology, but starting from human needs. I think scale fundamentally serves a purpose, right? It's great to have big platforms and large megaphones, but when you think about your local community or the life that you live day to day, no one is saying that I should scale my neighborhood to include 3 billion people living in the 5 apartment buildings on the surrounding streets, right? And so there is a place for varied types of community and to be a part of various types of community. And that is important to having a healthy social infrastructure. The digital spaces that we have that allow us to connect with larger numbers of people, that allow us to maybe find community with like-minded people or with people that we may not have access and opportunity to connect with in our day-to-day lives are important spaces. But it's equally important to have spaces where you are connecting with people who are proximate to you. I think, I see sort of trying to keep one eye on the chat, the conversation about libraries, and we talk about libraries in our white paper as well, because they're these physical structures that provide space for local in-person community. They're also access to resources and information. I think coming back to what you were asking before, Lucy, about the internet and its purpose beyond communication platforms, access to resources, access to knowledge. When I think about my first entry point to the internet, it was about finding information. It was about, encyclopedias and being able to access knowledge that I needed faster. And so that if we can create that opportunity for more people to access knowledge, we can build digital spaces for that as well. And so the library is a great example of something that can evolve to serve kind of our digital, social, physical needs across the board, and has been doing that, I think, in a lot of cities across the country. But the work that Janice was talking about to really incorporate, I was talking earlier about systems being designed for governance and for effective governance, but we can also think about the governance and design playing sort of the opposite direction. So one of the things we talk about in our paper is how design is not just a process that happens in and of itself. It's a series of decisions that lead up to a process that you might consider the typical design. And then it's an ongoing series of decisions about what you do and how you do it moving forward. And so when we think about who should be involved and what access to expertise looks like and where people are in the conversation about what's happening in their communities and how we can get more people access to resources, that's a design question in the broadest sense of the word. And I think that's a really good place to start, is when we're thinking about, how do we make this better or different or do something that serves a higher number of people. We should be thinking about the design and what we're designing for and where the design process starts and who's involved in it.
Right. Great. And there's probably already been, and if not, there should be a shout out to the design justice work, the Design Justice Network, and Sasha Constantichuk's book on design justice as a fundamental piece of how the opportunity to rethink digital infrastructure is an opportunity to rethink governance. Any other comments on that? There's quite a bit of discussion in any other comments on that question of the examples that are being built, the alternatives that are existing, and the relationship to the kind of existing mass centralized surveillance structures?
I wanted to plus one Katie's point about scale. The logic of venture capital demands scale at the hundreds of millions or billions point. But we don't actually try to scale anything else in society to those points, right? That's a scale that really only makes sense for consumers, for advertisers trying to reach audiences. When we try to build a healthy community, we try to build it around a few dozen highly active people. We try to expand it to include our building or our neighborhood. And we also have limits to how much we want to expand it. We understand that at a certain point, expanding a community would require structure. It probably requires subsets, different ways of going about these things. This is why I think thinking about the logics behind these things is so important. If you're operating from this perspective that you need to build a venture-backed startup that's going to make you billions of dollars, you have to think about hundreds of millions of people. If you're thinking, the way that Janice is, that it's critically important that people have access to broadband, to key information services, and that they have their hands involved with building them so that they get that sort of deep education in how these networks work and trying to figure out what's actually appropriate for communities, scale operates in a very, very different way. Software is hard to build at small scale. Anyone who's ever built software understands that you actually benefit from having a lot of users of it because you don't want to be maintaining all sorts of different things. This is the struggle that we have to sort of figure out between the technical alternatives and the community alternatives. To build successful communities, we have to build very, very small. Ideally, we do this around software that we can use in common, but we can use different features of, different affordances of in different contexts. But I'm thrilled that we're putting scale on the table so early on in this conversation, because it's utterly critical to how we think about redefining these spaces.
Right. Maricha?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on the question of, what do you reward? Because this bigger is better is often so much in contrast with Europe. Europeans often get accused of having failed to produce tech successes and all that, even though I don't know how you all feel during the pandemic, but, I happen to be in Amsterdam now because the president has an executive order banning me from returning to Stanford. But I'm happy that I can go outside and go to a small shop and purchase something. And Amazon is much less pervasive here. So the question is also scale at what price? And also literally, and I think the pandemic has unfortunately really shed light on this, who benefits in terms of profit? A few companies, and who bears the cost of the common good, right? Which I think is very much associated with public spaces and civic values. Because if, for example, big tech companies don't pay taxes, then there is no such redistribution or trickle down effect that really is sort of the promise of the entire free economies, right? And so I think, what do you aim for? What is the price? Who benefits are really important questions to ask. Another unrelated comment, but one that I still find important, is that often in the discussion about governing technology, there is now the push to include humans. But let's not forget that humans don't agree. And I don't think we as humans should accept that we are one category that then gets to have a say. It should be much more, varied, inclusive, and specific than just having a human, because it almost plays into hands of populism by implying that humans are one, right? I hear it from people who want to defend AI in a certain way and saying, oh, it's no problem, a human will be in the loop, don't worry about it. And I hear from populists saying like the people and then something. And I think we have to caution against bundling the people too much.
Yeah, thank you for that cautionary. Yeah, Katie?
Sorry, one little thing. I think I'm going to paint with a broad brush and maybe be intentionally a little controversial here, but I might argue that there are very, very few things in the world that I can think of that actually could be designed to serve hundreds of millions of people. That everything that we have, that we see that's been scaled successfully, actually has just been scaled to the point that it destroyed all their competitors, and then the massive company that owns it differentiates their product to serve lots of different users with different needs. And I think, in fact, the sort of scale that actually matters is interoperability, not scale of one product. And so to Ethan's point about how do we make sure things sort of can work together, right? Like that telephone systems work together, they're interoperable, but we don't have to have a huge scale of one thing. And so I think, we can very easily live in a world where we design things that work for smaller communities and are interoperable so that they can speak to each other and we can move seamlessly across them. But we don't need things that serve, we don't need very many things that serve hundreds of millions or billions of people with one product or service.
Right. Brilliant. Thank you. Sabelo.
Okay, so I wanted to plus to the last two comments. The first one being that some things should scale and can scale, and some things are not meant to scale. And so we have to define then, what are those things that are better accomplished or better served when they're localized as opposed to scaling. But yeah, also thinking about, the idea of this, these contested terms or definitions like public interest. Well, what is public interest, right? Human worth, human dignity. How do we define those things? What if two societies have different views of what is actually human dignity, right? For example, I could believe that nobody should be poor, and that's my sense of human dignity. Whereas in other societies, that might not be so emphasized. So these are always, contested terms, and I think the central idea is that communities and societies have to be able to have the mechanisms to, come up with their own, definitions that sort of, make sense, and then be able to act upon those without relying on this centralized, colonized digital infrastructure.
So let me jump in there with some of the questions specific to the chat, and we're going to, I think because we're just having a good conversation, we can keep the recording going. But to this question of scale, I mean, all of you have spoken to the need for rethinking that if you center human dignity, civics, racial equity, it's an entirely different equation. But the fact of the matter is we live in a world where there are, I don't know, someone knows, 8, 10 companies that operate beyond the scale of nation states and have an extraordinary amount of power. And so the question, I'm modifying this upvoted question a bit, but I'm wondering what can we do to take what we've learned and are learning from these community-led efforts that exist in great number around the world that operate in this different logic, to have some kind of transformative effect on how we think about governance itself in light of the existence of those big, powerful corporate players.
So one of the ways that I'm hoping we might start getting beyond just imagining these different networks and actually start building them is by working with real world communities as well as virtual communities who've already done some deep thinking about governance, to do the sort of design justice work that Sasha Costanza-Chock talks about, to do the sort of on the ground organizing that Janice is doing. You need groups that actually already have policies in place for how they govern, whether they're governing via consensus, whether they're using sort of other methods to work their way through. So one of the things that I think we need to do is learn from these existing models and then try to build the tools that sort of scaffold those discussions and make them possible. I think we've learned very little actually about how we govern online spaces. I can look at Wikimedia, which has this sort of wonderfully chaotic governance system where you sort of bang on something until you get to consensus. You can look at sort of Reddit's system of essentially appointing mini dictators and giving them authority over their spaces. There's great researchers out there like Nathan Matthias who are helping people run communities where they experiment on what sort of governance works better. But I actually think our governance offline is much more sophisticated than online. And so I think part of what we do is we start looking for high functioning communities and we sort of say, can we augment what you're already doing by helping you build social media spaces that operate along these sort of governance principles that you're using and sort of embed them within code as well. Part of what I'm hoping for out of this is to solve one of the problems that Bob Putnam identified with American democracy, which is lowered rates of face-to-face participation. Putnam's worried about this not just because he wants everyone to participate in bowling leagues, but because he believes that they train us in small d democracy, the actual process of running a meeting or dealing with a controversial issue. My hope is that what we start seeing on these networks are people getting their education in small d democracy by interacting with people to figure out how you run these spaces together. I also wanted to talk very briefly about interoperability. People have been mentioning in the chat associated with this that interoperability is the way that you work at scale. And Katie made the point that the really enormous systems that we rely on, things on the global credit card processing network or the telephone system, these are small networks that have been sort of joined together. The work that I'm doing around this is mostly focused on the client side. It's basically trying to create a browser that lets you look at these new kind of social networks that we're talking about building at the same time as you look at existing ones. And the reason that I'm doing this, the reason that I'm building something that lets you use Twitter and use Facebook and use YouTube, but also use a new 20-person social network expressly designed for decolonization, or a 500-person social network designed to help the local broadband collective, is that many people's plans in the space start with first everyone quits Facebook, then we all move to my platform, and then everything gets better. And steps 1 and 2 are really tricky in that equation. What we actually need to do is embrace something that Cory Doctorow calls adversarial interoperability.
Yeah.
We need to start building things that are way better than Facebook or Twitter as they are now. They give us more control, they give us more authority. We continue using those networks because, you know what, that's still how I stay in touch with my uncle. But we also start using these new networks that actually respect our human dignity and give us a role in governance and give us a role in actually shaping those spaces. So I think architecturally, that's how we start getting there. For people who want to talk about the architectural geekery behind this, I'm happy to have those conversations. But I think conceptually, understanding that governance first and deep adversarial interop to sort of get to the point where we can build this collectively are those ways to go.
Great. Other thoughts from people on the panel about that? There's a lot of response to the idea of a dual power strategy here, of really building robust alternatives and making sure people know that they exist and can use them as the way forward. Question from the audience that builds. Did I cut you? Oh, go ahead, Sibylla. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt there. I really support, I like the idea of the dual power strategy. And I'm wondering, and I may not be willing in this question, but the massive scale that already exists with some of these platforms, does it make it so almost impossible because we've become conditioned to certain things? Could we, in other words, can we replicate these features which we've come to rely on? Maybe even features that are addictive in completely different platforms without losing some of that, whatever it is that keeps us hooked in those platforms. And I'm asking because I've seen alternative platforms to the Facebooks and so forth, no tracking, no surveillance and so forth, but they somehow never seem to take off all the way completely. And so how do we create robust platforms that are, that can really move us across all the way, to a new reality?
Any thoughts from?
I'll just share, Lucy. I think when you first asked the question, about like how can we get beyond imagining, it took me back to like for us, what has been coming up as we are 4 years into this work is scale. And initially we were thinking, we had each of our networks, do this feasibility study, and it was very heavily kind of tech focused. So 1 gigabit connection can hold 700 households, and that was kind of the direction that we were headed in. But then we had to like take a step back and think, well, is that really kind of what this neighborhood needs? And if we like, how do we even think of scaling to that, while also keeping relationships centered. And so, yeah, I don't have an answer to the question of kind of what scale means, just that we're grappling with that definition currently. And thinking about what Ethan and Richa was sharing, like what type of scale matters, who pays the cost for that, and who benefits from that. And how do you do that while keeping, relationship centered, the people centered, and the community centered. So just, for a small kind of grassroots team as ours, thinking about, how we scale, how we connect more people, it's just a big question that I think we're grappling with. And I think the answer to that is to kind of not think about scale in the way that, another ISP or another system would think about it, but really kind of think about it in terms of, I think, what our community needs, what's happening in the city, the overall, I think, context. So just kind of generating our own definition around what scale means versus kind of falling in line with what scale and scaling currently looks like.
Right. Thank you, Janice. And I'm hearing in that actually a partial or part of an answer to a question that we're not going to have time for, which is about the narratives that people have found that help both build this work at its really truly local and community owned level, and then the connections a sort of a level up from that then either connect that to the governing framework that allows those alternatives to thrive, which is something that the governing networks can be built at a larger scale, but also that help people understand where these alternatives fit in their lives, if you will. I want to give each of you 30 seconds to say a final word, and then let people know that we will be capturing the chat. We have another event scheduled on October 27th, and I'll tell you about that to continue this conversation. But let me ask each of the panelists if there's one final thought as you think about where we started with this idea of alternative logics to where we are now with this robust appreciation for community-led alternatives. Why don't I start with Sabelo?
Thank you so much, Lucy. I would just like to say that I really appreciated, how this panel was organized and even the makeup of it, and I think that sort of signifies where we need to go, because there are many more conversations that have to be had. And it's also significant that we have a diversity of perspectives in those conversations. And so I'm thankful to my colleagues and thankful to the center and the department for really, demonstrating that by even how we organize this panel and the topics in the panel. Thank you so much.
Thanks for participating, Sabelo. Katie.
Yeah. I would also echo the thanks, and it's been really great to talk with you all, and the questions in the chat have really also been incredible. I think, I'll end on sort of a high level note. In our white paper and the work that we're doing on infrastructure, we talk about sort of redefining it and having this multidimensional approach. But ultimately, what we believe is that we need to define, design, govern, and fund infrastructure differently. And I feel like all of those things have come up today in our conversation and in the chat and the Q&A. And the thing that we can be focused on is, I think there's both the aspirational goal of how can we build from the ground up new communities and new ways of doing things, but also the intermediate step, I think, is that we can address some of the systems that we have that are broken or partially broken or not serving us, and we can take power and ownership, and there are many mechanisms by which we can do that, and we should be thinking about both the aspirational big picture, build new from the ground up, and also the intermediate, how do we get to a place where we're doing better with what we have too, because I think doing better with what we have will help serve the aspirational long-term goal.
Wonderful. Thanks, Katie. Maricha.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think there's so much to say, but the momentum for showing an alternative, I think, give a lot of agency to even the smallest examples of how it can be done. But if at all possible here, scaling in terms of coalition building, I do think really helps vis-a-vis decision makers, for example, if that's where you need to, leverage and get support for your agenda. And as such, I've always found that having a sort of common narrative about what people are doing together can help, people's understanding about what should be done to make change. Could be politically, could be, among civil society organizations or whatnot. But my strong inclination is that the momentum to tilt from privately governed to publicly governed on the basis of civic values, inclusiveness, legitimacy, and participation is now. So I hope it empowers people. And if it's not going fast enough, I'm still a big appreciator of small and high quality rather than big and sort of only profit driven without leaving much value to the community.
Thank you, Maricha. Janice, you're an excellent example of small and high quality. Any last thoughts?
Yeah, something Sabelo said earlier, that reclaiming is an act of decolonization. And when you said that, it made me think of this quote by Audre Lorde about the master's tool will never dismantle the master's house. And we look at EII as, yes, an alternative, but it's also us creating the world that we want to see in our communities. So I would, argue that I don't necessarily think that we can reclaim something that wasn't built for us. I think that we have to totally dismantle it and rebuild it so that it is community-centered, human-focused, and rooted in racial equity.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah, it's about of claiming. Yes, thank you very much, Janice. And Ethan.
Lucy, I'm really grateful for you setting up this event, and particularly for creating such a diverse range of views, and people sort of reacting to the ideas that I'm sharing and brought into this conversation. I think I want to leave maybe with the idea that there are a lot of people out there thinking about alternative social media networks, but I feel like there's too few actually working from real world communities. And I feel like this is a conversation that often doesn't escape the realm of the technical. And even in some of the examples that I'm putting forward, you know, with Tim Berners-Lee and Jimmy Wales putting these forward, there's a bunch of old white dudes sort of thinking about how to solve this as a technical problem. I think one of the big things that needs to happen is that we need to be learning from real world communities, particularly real world communities working on digital issues, to try to understand communities better and have that inform the conversation rather than having the technology dominate it. And I'm really grateful for the ways in which you structured this conversation that brings that forward.
Thanks, Ethan. And thank you to all of you, to all of the people on screen and to all of the people in the chat. We will capture all of that. This is the beginning of conversations, not by any means the end. And we're really eager to hear from folks what they think is our opportunistic next steps. The conversation next Tuesday on October 27th, which we invite you to join us for, is going to be launched off of an idea for a corporation for public software. But I can tell you that the people who are planning that conversation are really hoping to get your insights on what's a corporation, what's public, and what's software. So it's not a fully baked idea. It's an idea looking for the kind of insights and resources and coalitions of things already happening that are well reflected in the chat. So please join us for that. We will share a recording. We will share notes from the chat here. And again, we're building toward synthetic reflection on this three-part conversation, and very much hope that the conversations and work will continue. Thank you to everybody who joined us on screen, both in the text and visually, and see you next week.